Welcome to this APUSH quick review for period 7, period from 1890 to 1945. This period comprises one of the largest chunks of information on the AP exam, and it's a busy time. This is the era of imperialism, progressivism, the Roaring Twenties, World War I, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. So let's dive in. One of the big themes for the time period is the progressive reform movement, which responded to the evils of industrial capitalism, of the robber barons, working to limit the impact of these large corporations or trusts on the American economy, wanting to improve the quality of American democracy, protect the health of the public, and conserve the nation's resources. And they did this through a variety of means, mostly using the power of government through the work of experts in various areas to craft laws that would save us from, for example, spoiled meat in the Meat Inspection Act, or to protect workers in the wake of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, to pass amendments like the direct election of senators so that democracy could be improved. This was not a unified movement. Even though it was national and occurred at the state level, it was flavored differently in different places. Southern progressives were very populist in trying to limit the influence of railroads, whereas Northern progressives had a different set of concerns to work with in the urban areas of the North. But they do share in common a general middle-class urban outlook. This is modern America confronting the modern problems of industrialization. And they do share an outlook that says science and expertise matters, so we will call upon people with training and advanced knowledge in, successful government, or people who have expertise in labor movements and labor economics. After the progressive movement collapsed, America waits for a time through the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression before phase 2 of the progressives comes back, and that is the New Deal. We can see the New Deal as essentially progressivism part 2, and the idea there is, now that the economy has crashed in the Great Depression, how can we revive these progressive ideas and save the American economic system from this Great Depression? The New Deal did that through a series of reform, relief, and recovery programs like the CCC, the WPA, FERA, the SEC, all those acronyms that we spent time learning. And some of those programs were designed to fix the problem immediately, unemployment. Others were designed to be long-term, like Social Security, one of the long-lasting legacies of the New Deal. Another long-lasting legacy of the New Deal is it creates the modern Democratic Party as a coalition of African Americans, working class Americans, and northern urban residents. This will begin the shift in party identity that will eventually cause the parties to kind of flip their positions as well as flip their geographic regions. But keep in mind, that shift will take time and won't be completed until the 70s. A second theme of this entire period is incredible cultural change, both from people moving into the United States as well as this new urban world created in the 20th century. There's a lot of migration in period 7. Migration inside the United States, such as African Americans moving to the South to get jobs in the North, the Great Migration. Migration from people in Mexico and South America and Latin America coming to the US for jobs, and migration from Southern and Eastern Europe. But the migration is going to be met with increased xenophobia, as Americans are concerned that the migrants will not melt or assimilate into the American culture, get in that melting pot. They're concerned that migrants might be radicals and anarchists who will wield bombs to destroy the American way of life. And so we see after World War I a Red Scare first, which there are deportations of people deemed threats to America. And then it's followed up by immigration quotas in 1921 and 1924 to narrow that stream of migrants into the United States. As a result of movements of these people, new regional identities are being formed. An example of that would be the Harlem Renaissance, as Harlem becomes dominated by African Americans in that community, and they create a new world of culture and arts and literature that will enable them to celebrate the African American experience and the contributions of African Americans to the United States. Urban populations will also increase as America is increasingly more urbanized. 1920 is the year we recognize generally that urbanization is greater than the number of people living in rural areas. And therefore, we're starting to see America being driven by the concerns, interests, needs of city dwellers rather than people on the farms in the countryside. And those new urban residents, whether they are migrants from the South or migrants from outside the United States, create an urban culture that in the 20s is incredibly materialistic. As radio proliferates, as movies become more common, with the first talking movies where the sound and the picture are together by the late 20s, this creates a shared national culture that is really geared around what urban life is about. But that doesn't mean that rural America is accepting of this new urban kind of world. So we get lots of tension between city dwellers and people who live in the countryside over gender roles. The image of the flapper, for example, that these young girls are going off and having a great time in the city, and oh my gosh, that's not what Jesus would have wanted, and that's not the way of our grandmothers and such, according to rural residents. There's conflict over the new modern way of life that's more scientific, whereas rural people cling to the biblical worldviews that they think are the way that they should go. We see that, for example, in debates over the teaching of evolution in Tennessee in the late 20s. We see the tensions between urban and rural in the rise of the second KKK, which is in its mind confronting this new culture of drinking and migrants and urban disorder and decay that is not Christian and not American in their way of thinking. So as much as America is changing, the tensions between the urban and rural areas impacted by all this movement, this migration, is going to create several flashpoints during the 1920s as this new modern world is taking off, much to the dismay of those simple, God-fearing countryside dwellers. A third theme of period 7 is America's global involvement. Starting with imperialism in the 1890s, with the United States' annexation of Hawaii, followed up with the Spanish-American War and the taking of territories that we protect as protectorates, as well as territories that we govern with no intention of granting them statehood. Why do we do this? Well, imperialism is driven by a desire for markets, so we want to make money selling products around the world. We want to get resources for the things that we make. We are driven by racism. There's a sense that imperialism is justifiable because America is cleaning up and bringing culture and civilization and Christianity to people in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And we're also spreading democracy. This is what we have to offer the world, is the Anglo-Saxon heirs to primitive democracy in Europe. Americans have mastered what it means to be truly democratic, and we can teach the peoples of the world that. Even if it means forcing it down their throats, because we know what's good for them, as in the case of the Philippines. Anti-imperialists did reject this imperial focus, saying that it's un-American. America does not need colonies, and colonies, in fact, are not the way we should be operating. Many of the anti-imperialists were also racists in that they thought if America took these foreign lands, then we would be flooded with migrants who would not assimilate into American culture. A second global conflict in this time period that involves us into the world is World War I, where we try to be neutral at first. However, we can't really sustain that neutrality, and so we declare war after the Germans engage in unrestricted submarine warfare, and we discover the Zimmerman note that the British end up handing to us. More important to know about World War I is the US's return to its unilateral position after the war. Unilateralism is not quite the same as isolationism. We're never truly isolated. We're always trading, always involved in the world. But unilateralism means the US goes alone. It does its own thing without input from other people. And you can see that pretty strongly in our rejection of the League of Nations, even though it is created by President Wilson. The United States Senate rejects the League, saying we'll be pulled into European wars, we'll forever be locked up in the politics of what's going on around the world. We'd just rather trade, 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 trade. We see a similar sense of isolation, withdrawing from the world during the 30s. I mean, after all, it's the Great Depression, America's struggling. But also, there's this fear that involvement in the world and in the growing conflict in Europe in the late 30s will just be hurtful to the US. We don't need our sons going off and dying in another European war. So we try to stay out as long as possible, but eventually we will join in World War II. Probably the most important thing to know about World War II is its effect on the domestic front, with the opportunity for minorities. Women take wartime jobs. African Americans get help from the president, who signs a Fair Employment Practices Commission to ban discrimination in hiring. We bring bracero workers from Mexico. So there is definite benefit for minorities seeking employment. If you are Japanese, on the other hand, even if you're an American citizen but of Japanese ancestry, you're going to find yourself not benefiting during World War II because of the internment camps that are created to house potentially disloyal Japanese citizens. At the end of the war, atomic bombs position the United States as the strongest nation on the earth, and as the leader of the globe's politics, we are relatively not harmed by the war, relatively speaking. We are going to now lead the world in rebuilding, saving the world eventually from communism, and maintaining our position as the global leader. The fourth theme of period 7 is the massive swinging economic changes of the era. As the United States became urbanized and increasingly industrialized, new technologies improved the standard of living for people. So cars and phones, indoor plumbing spreads, the refrigerator, radio. That raises the standard of living for Americans' lives, connects them in new ways. But the economy is fairly shaky, and that is seen in the Great Depression that began in 1929 as our stock markets, unregulated stock markets, are trending upwards, and then finally crash when there are more sellers than buyers of stock. Minor crashes before this time period, before 1929, also reinforced the need for regulation of the economy. So 1893, for example, panic then. There is another one in 1907. There is a small, short-lived contraction after World War I. And all of this pushes the idea that the U.S. needs to do a better job regulating capitalism, that capitalism sometimes self-destructs. It just rises high and then crashes. The other economic aspect of this time period that's important to note is that the U.S., because of its imperialism, is heavily involved in the resources and markets of other places, like sugar in Cuba and rubber down in Brazil. And our policies here in the United States, such as the Roosevelt Corollary, or dollar diplomacy, or even moral diplomacy, help regulate our control over these other countries. Economically speaking, World War II brings us out of the Great Depression, but the way it does that is by setting us up for what will come during the 1950s, pretty dramatic growth. For one thing, people are forced to save during World War II because they have to ration goods. They can't buy cool new things like a car, so they've got to save that money, and then after the war, they'll be able to spend it. Not only that, new technologies during the war will create new jobs, particularly the atomic bomb, and then subsequent developments to make it better, to improve triggers, to improve missiles. Those kinds of jobs funded by the government will help keep the U.S. out of depression after World War II is over. So as Americans recover from the Great Depression, they will then be poised to be a part of one of the best economies the United States had ever experienced, the middle class economy of the 1950s, which was really great for people who were supported by the GI Bill and other government funding, but not necessarily as successful for people who were not included in this prosperity, so minority groups, for example. That has been our look at period 7.